Welcome to Revenge Central. Today I will read two very interesting revenge stories. If you enjoy this content, please consider subscribing and let's get started with Story 2, The Head Chef Who Thought He Was God, and the Line Cook Who Proved He Wasn't. There is a particular kind of heat that exists only in a professional kitchen during the dinner rush. It is not just thermal, it is atmospheric. It is the heat of 12 burners roaring and 4 ovens working, and a flat top that could brand cattle, and the collective body heat of 8 people moving in a space designed for 6. It is the heat of urgency, of tickets stacking up like playing cards, of voices calling out orders in a language that sounds like gibberish to anyone who has not spent years learning it. I loved that heat. I breathed it like oxygen. It was the only place in my life where I felt completely alive, completely present, completely myself. His name was Richard Fontaine, and he was the head chef at L'Etoile, which was one of those restaurants that food critics described as important and normal people described as expensive, and the people who worked there described, in private, as a cult with better knives. Richard had trained in Paris, or so he said. He had worked under Michelin-starred chefs, or so he claimed. He had a temper that could strip paint and a vocabulary of insults that could make a longshoreman blush. And when he walked into the kitchen at 3 p.m, in his pristine white coat with his name embroidered on the chest in blue thread, every single person in that room straightened up and worked harder. Because Richard Fontaine made you feel like your entire career depended on not disappointing him in the next 30 seconds. I arrived at L'Etoile as a line cook 2 years ago. I was 26 years old. I had graduated from culinary school 18 months earlier, and I had worked at 2 other restaurants before this one, neither of which had prepared me for Richard. The interview was 10 minutes long. He looked at my resume, looked at me, and said, "Can you make a proper bechamel?" I said yes. He said, "Prove it." He pointed to a stove and a pot and a whisk and a carton of milk and a pound of butter and a bag of flour, and I made a bechamel that was, if I may say so, flawless. He tasted it. He did not smile. He said, "You start Monday. Do not be late. I can replace you before you finish tying your apron." That was Richard. Everything was a test. Let me give you a sense of what it meant to work for this man. On my 3rd day, I made a mistake on a sauce, a slight over-reduction that made the consistency a touch too thick. Richard picked up a spoon, tasted it, and threw the spoon at the wall so hard it left a dent in the stainless steel. He said, "My grandmother makes better sauce, and she has been dead for 15 years. Then he picked up the pot and poured the entire batch down the drain, 4 liters of sauce that had taken me 45 minutes to prepare, and told me to start over. I started over. I did not make that mistake again. On my 2nd week, a new dishwasher started, named Julio, a kid from El Salvador who was 19 years old and spoke almost no English and who had the most incredible work ethic I have ever seen. Julio worked harder than anyone in that kitchen. He was the first one there and the last one to leave, and he never complained, not once. Even when Richard screamed at him for spots on the wine glasses that were actually water stains from the dishwasher itself. One night, Richard lost his temper because a table sent back a steak that was overcooked, and he turned around and screamed at Julio in front of everyone, saying, "What is wrong with you? Are you stupid? Can you not do the one thing you are paid to do?" Julio stood there with his head down and his hands at his sides and said nothing, and later that night I found him in the alley behind the restaurant, crying. I gave him a cigarette, even though I do not smoke, and we stood there together in the dark, and he told me, in broken English, that he had sent every dollar he earned to his mother in El Salvador, and that he could not afford to lose this job. I told him I understood. I did not tell him that I had also cried in that alley, on my 1st week, after Richard had made me feel like the most worthless human being on the planet. Everything was a competition that only he could win. The kitchen operated on a system of praise that was so rare it was practically mythical. If Richard told you acceptable, that was the equivalent of a standing ovation. If he told you good, you went home and told your friends and they looked at you like you had seen the face of God. In 2 years, I heard Richard say good maybe a dozen times. I never heard him say excellent. That word was reserved for his own cooking, and even then he used it sparingly, as though excellence was a standard so impossibly high that even he could only occasionally reach it. But here is the thing about Richard Fontaine. He was not actually a great chef. He was a competent chef, He could execute classical French technique with precision, and he understood flavor profiles, and he had a palate that could detect a single grain of oversalted seasoning in a quart of sauce. But he was not inventive. He was not creative. Every dish on the L'Étoile menu was a variation of something he had learned from someone else, and he had not added a new dish to the menu in the 4 years since he had taken over the kitchen. The tasting menu, which changed seasonally, was really just the same dishes with different garnishes. Spring meant morels and peas. Summer meant tomatoes and corn. Fall meant squash and game. Winter meant root vegetables and braised meats. The variations were superficial. The cooking was mechanical. Richard was a technician, not an artist, and he knew it, and it ate at him like acid on metal. I, on the other hand, was an artist. I am not saying this to boast. I am saying it because it is a fact, the way it is a fact, that water boils at 212 degrees and that you should never put olive oil in a non-stick pan. I have always had the ability to combine flavors in unexpected ways, to taste a dish and know exactly what it needs, to create something from nothing that makes people close their eyes and make small sounds of pleasure. It is a gift. I did not earn it. I just have it. The first time I created a new dish at L'Étoile, it was an accident. We were short on ingredients one night because the produce delivery had been delayed, and Richard was in one of his moods, which meant the kitchen was operating under a cloud of silent menace. The special that night was supposed to be a seared scallop with cauliflower puree, but we had no cauliflower. I had, however, a beautiful batch of celery root that I had been preparing for a soup special the next day, and I had been thinking about a flavor combination that involved brown butter and sage and a touch of apple cider vinegar, and so I made a celery root puree with those elements, and I plated it with the seared scallops, and I set it in the pass. Richard picked up the plate. He looked at it. He tasted it. He put the plate down. He looked at me. He said nothing. He walked away. I thought I was going to be fired. 30 seconds later, he came back. He said, "Make 4 more of those. Put it on the special board." That was it. That was the closest Richard ever came to saying he liked something I made. The dish became a regular special. Customers loved it. The food critic from the City magazine came in and ordered it and wrote about it in her review, calling it a revelation of flavor that demonstrates the kitchen's willingness to take risks. She attributed it to Richard, of course. She always attributed everything to Richard. His name was on the menu. His face was in the publicity photos. He was the chef. The rest of us were invisible. That was the first time, but it was not the last. Over the next year and a half, I created maybe 24 dishes that ended up on the L'Étoile menu. Some were specials that became permanent fixtures. Others were seasonal additions that rotated through the tasting menu. All of them were attributed to Richard. All of them were described in reviews and articles and social media posts as his creations. He never once acknowledged that they were mine. He never once said, "This is Marcus's dish," or "Marcus developed this recipe," or even, "My team contributed to this." He took credit for everything with the casual entitlement of a man who believed that the world owed him its best ideas, and that the people who generated those ideas were merely instruments of his genius. I should have said something. I know that. The thing about working in a professional kitchen is that it normalizes behavior that would be completely unacceptable in any other workplace. Screaming is normal. Throwing things is normal. Being called names is normal. Working 12-hour shifts without breaks is normal. Burning yourself and cutting yourself and developing calluses on your hands that look like they belong to a construction worker is normal. You start to believe that this is just how kitchens are, that this is the price you pay for doing the work you love, that the abuse is somehow inseparable from the art. It is not. I know that now. I have worked in kitchens since then, where people treat each other with respect, where mistakes are corrected with words instead of flying objects, where the head chef says please and thank you, and sometimes even says, "Good job." And the food in those kitchens is every bit as good as the food at L'Étoile, because good food comes from good people who love what they do, not from fear and intimidation. But when you are inside it, when you are living it every day, you cannot see it clearly. You adapt. You develop a thick skin. You tell yourself that Richard is tough but fair, even though he is not fair, even though there is nothing fair about a man who takes credit for your creativity, while simultaneously making you feel like your creativity is worthless. Every chef who has ever worked in someone else's kitchen knows that recipe attribution is one of the most fraught and complicated issues in the industry. Recipes are not like novels or paintings. They evolve. They are collaborative. One person creates the base, another refines the technique, a third adjusts the seasoning. Who owns a recipe? It is a question that has launched 1,000 arguments and ended 1,000 friendships. But these were not collaborative recipes. These were dishes that I created from scratch, in my head, based on my own flavor instincts and my own technical knowledge. I wrote them down in my notebook, which I kept in my locker. I developed them during prep shifts, when Richard was not in the kitchen. I tested them on my own time, using ingredients I purchased with my own money. And then I brought them to work, and Richard took them and put his name on them, and smiled for the cameras. The stealing was infuriating, but it was not the worst part. The worst part was the abuse. Richard treated every person in his kitchen like a personal punching bag, but he had a special reserve of cruelty for me, and I think it was because he knew, on some level, that I was better than him, and that knowledge made him vicious. He called me names that I will not repeat. He threw things at me, including a full pot of risotto that left a burn on my forearm that I still have a scar from. He once made me stand in the walk-in refrigerator for 45 minutes as punishment for overcooking a piece of fish by 30 seconds. He told me, in front of the entire kitchen staff, that I was the most overrated cook he had ever worked with, and that the only reason you are still here is because I haven't found anyone better to do the grunt work. I stayed because I loved the work. I stayed because L'Etoile was a name that mattered on a resume, and because I needed the experience, and because somewhere in the back of my mind I still believed that if I just kept creating, kept innovating, kept putting beautiful food on plates, eventually someone would notice. Eventually the truth would out. Eventually the world would see what Richard Fontaine really was, a mediocre chef standing on the shoulders of the people he was crushing beneath him. The turning point came on a Tuesday night in October. We were in the middle of the dinner rush, and I was working the sauté station, which was the busiest and most demanding station in the kitchen. A ticket came in for the tasting menu, and one of the courses was a dish I had created, a duck breast with cherry gastrique and roasted turnips. I had developed that dish specifically for the fall menu. I had tested it 11 times before bringing it to Richard. I had sourced the cherries from a specific farm in Michigan because their tartness balanced the richness of the duck in a way that grocery store cherries could not. My art. The ticket said the customer had a nut allergy. The duck dish did not contain nuts, but the turnips were roasted with a hazelnut oil that I had suggested as a substitution for the usual butter, because it gave the turnips a nutty depth that complemented the cherry gastrique beautifully. Richard knew about the hazelnut oil. He had approved it. He had tasted the dish with the hazelnut oil and had said it was acceptable, which was his highest compliment. I flagged the ticket and called out to Richard. Tasting menu course 4, table 12, nut allergy, hazelnut oil on the turnips. Richard was at the pass, expediting. He looked at me. He looked at the ticket. He said, "Just use regular butter. It's fine." I said, "Chef, the whole point of the hazelnut oil is the flavor balance with the cherry. Butter will make it flat." He said, "I said it's fine. Are you arguing with me?" The kitchen went quiet. Everyone was listening. I said, "No, chef." I made the dish with butter. It was fine. It was not what I had created. It was a diminished version, a compromise, a surrender. The customer ate it and presumably enjoyed it, or at least did not complain. And the night moved on, and I went home and sat in my apartment and stared at the wall and felt something inside me shift, like a tectonic plate moving, slow and deep and irreversible. Because here is what I realized that night, sitting in my apartment in my grease-stained chef pants with the smell of seared duck still in my hair. Richard Fontaine was not just stealing my recipes, he was stealing my food. He was taking the things I created and stripping them of their identity, their intention, their soul. He was serving my art with butter instead of hazelnut oil and calling it acceptable, and he was doing it in front of 80 people a night who had no idea that the hands that had created their meal were not the hands of the man whose name was on the door. The next morning, I bought a small voice-activated recorder. I bought 2 of them, actually, one for my jacket pocket and one that I could clip inside my apron. I also bought a tiny camera, the kind that looks like a button. It was the size of a shirt button, black, with a lens no wider than a pencil eraser. I bought it online from a store that specialized in surveillance equipment, and when it arrived in a plain brown box, I sat at my kitchen table and looked at it for a long time, turning it over in my fingers, thinking about what I was about to do. There was a moment, a real moment of doubt, where I almost put it back in the box and returned it. Because once you start recording, you have crossed a line. You have made yourself an observer instead of a participant. You have turned your workplace into evidence. That line, once crossed, cannot be uncrossed. I sewed the camera onto the left breast pocket of my third work shirt, the one with the scorch mark on the sleeve from a misdirected torch. The camera was positioned so that it pointed slightly upward, giving a clear view of the pass, which was the command center of the kitchen and the place where Richard spent most of his time during service. I tested it twice at home, recording myself cooking dinner, and the footage was remarkably clear. You could see facial expressions. You could read lips. You could see the color of the sauces as they were plated. It was, in its own small way, a perfect instrument. I also started keeping a written log. Every day, in a small black moleskin notebook that I kept in my backpack, I wrote down everything that happened in the kitchen, who said what, who did what went wrong and what went right, what Richard stole and what Richard broke and what Richard screamed. The notebook was not evidence in the legal sense, because it was my word against his, but it gave me a timeline, a framework, a way to organize the chaos of daily kitchen life into something coherent and damning. By the time I was done, the notebook had 93 pages of entries, written in my small, precise handwriting, and it was, I think, the most meticulous document I have ever produced, more careful than any recipe, more detailed than any prep list. And I sewed it onto one of my work shirts, positioned so that it pointed at the pass, which was where Richard spent most of his time during service. I know what you are thinking. Recording people without their consent is illegal in many jurisdictions. I checked. In my state, as long as one party to the conversation consents to the recording, it is legal. I was a party to every conversation I recorded. I was also aware that my employer might not agree with my interpretation of the law, which is why I kept the recordings on a personal device that never connected to the restaurant's Wi-Fi, and why I transferred the files to a cloud storage account that only I could access, and why I backed everything up on a USB drive that I kept in a safety deposit box at my bank. The evidence accumulated slowly but steadily. Every time Richard took credit for one of my dishes in front of the dining room manager, I recorded it. Every time he told a server to tell a customer that a dish was the chef's creation, I recorded it. Every time he threw something at me or called me a name or made me stand in the walk-in, I recorded it. And every time he made a decision that compromised food safety, I recorded that too. The food safety violations were the most damning part of the whole operation. Richard had a practice that he called efficiency management, which was his way of describing a system whereby ingredients that were past their expiration date were relabeled with new dates and used in service. I am not talking about ingredients that were a day or two past their prime. I am talking about fish that had been in the walk-in for 9 days. I am talking about chicken that had turned slightly gray. I am talking about a container of creme fraiche that had grown a visible mold colony that Richard simply scraped off the top of before using the rest. There were also the temperature violations. The walk-in refrigerator had been malfunctioning for weeks, and the internal temperature was hovering around 42 degrees, which is 8 degrees above the safe threshold for cold storage. Richard knew this. He had been told by the maintenance company that the compressor needed to be replaced. He refused to approve the repair because it would cost $3,000, and he told the kitchen staff to just make it work. So we were storing fish and meat and dairy at 42 degrees, which is the temperature at which bacteria start to throw a party, and we were serving that food to people who were paying $250 for a tasting menu. I documented all of it. I took photos of the expiration dates and the relabeled containers. I became, in effect, a health inspector embedded in the kitchen, a spy in the ranks of the enemy. Every morning during prep, I would do a walkthrough of the walk-in and the reach-in coolers and the prep stations, photographing anything that looked suspicious. I kept a running inventory of expired items and noted when they were used in service. I recorded the ambient temperature of the walk-in 3 times a day. morning, mid-shift, and end of night. I noted the time that the compressor would cycle on and off, and how long the off cycles were getting longer and longer as the machine failed. I documented the mold on the creme fraiche with photographs that were detailed enough to see the individual spore clusters because I wanted the health department to understand that this was not a borderline case. This was not a matter of interpretation or judgment. This was a kitchen that was serving food that could have killed someone, and the person responsible was posing for photographs in culinary magazines. I recorded the temperature readings on my phone every day for 2 months. I kept a log of every instance where I was instructed to use expired ingredients, complete with dates, times, and the specific items involved. I had, by the time I was done, a comprehensive dossier of food safety violations that would make a health inspector weep. The timing of the exposure was not random. I want to be honest about something. The idea of exposing Richard had been in my mind for months before I actually did it. I had fantasies about it. During the long, quiet hours of prep work, while I was peeling carrots or picking herbs or reducing stock, I would imagine different scenarios. I would imagine standing up in the middle of service and announcing to the dining room that every dish they were eating had been created by me. I would imagine Richard's face. I would imagine the gasps. These fantasies sustained me during the worst of the abuse, but they were also a sign of how damaged I was. Because healthy people do not fantasize about dramatic confrontations as a coping mechanism. Healthy people quit their jobs and find better ones. But I was not healthy. I was exhausted and angry and deeply, profoundly sad in a way that I could not articulate to anyone, because in the restaurant industry, admitting that you are struggling is seen as weakness, and weakness is exploited. So I kept my mouth shut, and I kept cooking, and I kept creating. And I kept a meticulous record of everything Richard did, because somewhere in the back of my mind I knew that the record would matter someday, even if I did not know exactly how or when. I also want to be honest about the fact that my motivations were not entirely noble. Yes, I wanted to expose food safety violations that could have made people sick. Yes, I wanted to stop the credit theft that was erasing my contributions. But I also wanted revenge. I wanted Richard to feel what he had made me feel: small, invisible, worthless. I wanted him to stand in a room full of people who had once admired him and feel their admiration curdle into contempt. I wanted him to know what it was like to have something you created taken away from you and claimed by someone else. I am not proud of the vengeful part of my motivation, but I am not going to pretend it did not exist, because dishonesty about our own emotions is just another form of the cowardice that allows people like Richard to operate unchecked for as long as they do. L'Etoile had been nominated for a James Beard Award, which is the culinary equivalent of the Oscars, and the award ceremony was in 3 weeks. The restaurant was also being reviewed by the city's most influential food critic, a woman named Sandra Park, who had already visited twice and was planning a 3rd visit to finalize her review. Her review, if positive, would cement L'Etoile's status as one of the best restaurants in the city. A James Beard Award would cement its status as one of the best restaurants in the country. Richard was already insufferable about the nominations. He had started referring to himself as award-nominated Chef Fontaine in all his communications, and he had hired a publicist to manage the expected media attention. I chose Sandra Park's 3rd visit as my moment of execution. I had been in contact with Sandra for months, actually. I had sent her an anonymous email from a Proton Mail account, telling her that there was a story at L'Etoile that was bigger than a restaurant review. She was intrigued. She was a journalist at heart, beneath the food criticism, and she had a nose for a story the way Richard had a nose for over-salted sauce. We communicated through encrypted messaging. I did not tell her everything. I told her enough. On the night of her 3rd visit, I was ready. I had copies of my evidence stored in multiple locations. I had a detailed timeline of every recipe I had created, and every instance where Richard had claimed it as his own. I had temperature logs and expiration date photos, and audio recordings of Richard discussing his efficiency management system. I had a USB drive containing everything, and I had already mailed a backup copy to Sandra's editor at the newspaper. The dinner service that night was smooth, which was unusual for a review night. Richard was on his best behavior. He was calm and focused and almost pleasant, which was more unsettling than his usual rage. Every dish went out perfectly. The tasting menu was executed without a single error. I will remember that service for the rest of my life, not because it was flawless, but because of the tension of performing flawlessness while carrying the knowledge that it would all be over in a matter of hours. Every ticket I pulled felt like a farewell. Every plate I wiped felt like a goodbye. I was saying goodbye to the kitchen that had been my home for 2 years, to the burners I had learned to love, and the pans I had seasoned with my own sweat, and the knives I had sharpened until they could split a tomato by gravity alone. I was saying goodbye to the work, or at least to this version of it, and I was scared, because I did not know what came next. There was a moment during service, maybe halfway through, when Richard called for the duck course, and I plated it perfectly, and I set it in the pass, and Richard picked it up and examined it the way he always did, with that critical eye that missed nothing and appreciated nothing. He looked at the sear on the duck breast. He looked at the consistency of the gastrique. He looked at the turnips, roasted golden and glistening with hazelnut oil, and for just a second, maybe half a second, something flickered across his face that I had never seen before. It was not pride. It was not approval. It was something closer to recognition, as if, for one brief moment, he saw the dish not as his own accomplishment, but as someone else's, and he understood, in some dim and inarticulate way, the magnitude of what he had taken. Then the moment passed, and he sent the plate to the table, and he moved on to the next ticket, and I moved on to the next plate, and the machine of the dinner rush ground on, oblivious to the bomb that was ticking beneath it. Sandra and her dining companion ate their way through 7 courses over 3 hours, and I watched from my station as Richard personally plated the final course, which was, of course, my duck dish with cherry gastrique and hazelnut oil on the turnips, the one I had created, the one he had almost ruined with butter, the one that the food critic had praised in her previous review as a masterwork of autumnal cooking. After service, I went home. I showered, I poured myself a glass of whiskey. I sat at my computer, and I sent Sandra Park everything. The entire dossier. Every recording, every photo, every temperature log, every recipe notebook page with dates. I sent it to her at 11:47 at night, and I went to bed, and I slept better than I had slept in 2 years. The story broke 4 days later. Sandra published it simultaneously. I did not sleep the night before the article was published. I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling, and thought about all the ways this could go wrong. What if Sandra's editor decided the story was not strong enough? What if Richard's lawyers sent a cease and desist before the article went live? What if the recordings were not as damning as I thought they were? What if people believed Richard's inevitable denial? What if I had just destroyed my career for nothing? My phone buzzed at 6 in the morning with a notification from Sandra. It's live. My hands were shaking as I opened the link. I read the first paragraph, and then the second, and then the third, and by the time I got to the section about the food safety violations, I was crying, not because I was sad, but because I had been carrying this weight for so long, and now someone else was holding it, and the relief was so sudden and so overwhelming that my body did not know how to process it except through tears. The article was better than I had imagined. Sandra is a gifted writer, and she had taken my raw evidence and shaped it into a narrative that was both thorough and compelling. She did not sensationalize. She did not exaggerate. She let the facts speak for themselves, and the facts were damning enough. She included photographs of the relabeled containers, with the original expiration dates visible beneath the new labels. She included excerpts from my temperature logs, showing 42 degrees, day after day after day. She included a quote from Richard, captured on my recording, saying, "If the health department shows up, we tell them the thermometer is miscalibrated. It's a $5 fix and they never follow up," in the newspaper and on her widely read food blog, and it was everything I had hoped it would be, and more. The headline was, "Inside L'Etoile, Credit Theft, Food Safety Violations, and a Kitchen Culture of Fear." The article was 8,000 words long, and it included direct quotes from my recordings, photographs of relabeled expired ingredients, and a side-by-side comparison of my recipe notebook entries and the dishes on L'Etoile's menu. The impact was immediate and catastrophic. The health department launched an investigation within 24 hours. They came with 3 inspectors and a warrant, which was something I had not expected. Sandra's article had apparently been forwarded to the state health department by one of their own inspectors, who happened to be a regular reader of the newspaper's food section. The inspection lasted 6 hours. They took swab samples from every surface in the kitchen. They pulled the temperature logs from the walk-in's digital display, which confirmed my readings. 42 degrees, consistently, for the better part of 2 months. They opened every container in the walk-in and the reach-in and the prep coolers, and they found expired products in all 3, including a container of duck confit that was 3 weeks past its use-by date, and a tub of something that had once been aioli, but had since achieved a level of biological complexity that the lead inspector described as a genuine biohazard. They also found the label-making machine that Richard used to create his fresh expiration dates, still loaded with blank labels, sitting on a shelf in his office like a smoking gun in a detective novel. The inspector's report was 17 pages long. I know because it was made public, as all health inspection reports are, and I read every page of it with a satisfaction that I am not entirely proud of. The report documented 47 separate violations, organized by severity. Category 1 violations, the most serious, included improper food storage temperatures, use of expired food products, failure to maintain equipment, and failure to report a known pest infestation that Richard had apparently been dealing with by putting out traps and hoping no one noticed. The total fines came to $87,000, which was the largest fine levied against a restaurant in the city in over a decade. They showed up unannounced on a Friday afternoon and shut the kitchen down for violations that their lead inspector described as among the most serious I have seen in 20 years of inspections. The James Beard Committee revoked L'Etoile's nomination, releasing a statement that said the organization holds its nominees to the highest standards of professional and ethical conduct. Richard's publicist quit, publicly, in a social media post that was shared 14,000 times. Richard tried to fight back. He issued a statement calling the allegations baseless mitage. He gave an interview to a food industry trade publication in which he said that I was a talented but troubled cook who had personal issues that affected his judgment, and that the recipes in question were the result of a collaborative kitchen environment, and that no single person owns a dish. This last point was actually something I agreed with, in principle. Recipes are collaborative. But a collaborative environment requires acknowledgement of the collaborators, and Richard had never acknowledged anyone except himself. He also tried to contact Sandra Park directly, leaving a series of increasingly frantic voicemails on her office phone that she later played for me over drinks at a bar downtown. In the voicemails, Richard went through the 5 stages of grief in reverse order. He started with acceptance, saying he was willing to discuss a reasonable resolution. Then he moved to depression, saying that the article had destroyed everything he had worked for. Then bargaining, offering to set the record straight if Sandra would write a follow-up piece. Then anger, calling her a hack journalist who was exploiting a personal dispute for clicks. And finally denial, insisting that none of it was true and that he had lawyers who would prove it. Sandra saved all the voicemails. She told me they were the most entertaining thing that had happened in her career, and the work of a disgruntled former employee with an axe to grind. He did not name me, but he did not have to. Everyone in the restaurant industry knew the story was too detailed, too specific, too thoroughly documented to be the work of anyone but an insider. And the recipe evidence was impossible to refute. My notebook entries, with their dates and their crossed-out revisions and their specific ingredient measurements, matched the dishes on L'Etoile's menu with a precision that left no room for alternative explanations. The restaurant closed permanently 6 weeks after the article was published. The closing was announced on a Monday morning in an email to all staff from the owner's office. The email was 3 sentences long and contained the kind of corporate euphemism that is designed to soften a blow without actually softening it. After careful consideration, we have made the difficult decision to permanently close L'Etoile, effective immediately. We are grateful to our talented team for their dedication and wish them the best in their future endeavors. 2 years of my life, summed up in a "we are grateful" and a "best wishes." The staff scattered like leaves in a windstorm. Maria went to work at a bakery downtown where she could focus on bread, which was all she had ever wanted to do. David took a sous chef position at a hotel, which was less glamorous than L'Etoile, but paid better and treated him with respect. Julio went back to El Salvador, which broke my heart, because he had been working toward a green card and the closure of L'Etoile had disrupted his sponsorship. I lost track of most of the others, but I heard that the line cook who had replaced me at the sauté station, a kid named Tyler who had been at L'Etoile for only 3 months, went to culinary school on the strength of the experience, which is the kind of silver lining that makes you believe the universe occasionally gets things right. The building that housed L'Etoile was leased to a ramen restaurant 6 months later. I drove past it one evening and saw people lined up outside, waiting for a table, laughing and talking on their phones. None of them knew what had happened in that kitchen. None of them knew that the space where they were about to eat bowls of tonkatsu ramen had once been the site of one of the most spectacular professional implosions in the city's culinary history. I thought about going in and telling them, but I did not. Some stories belong to the past, and the past is where they should stay. The owner, a wealthy businessman who had invested heavily in L'Etoile's reputation, determined that the brand was irreparably damaged. Richard was sued by the owner for breach of contract and fraud. He was also investigated by the State Attorney General's office for food safety violations, and the investigation resulted in a fine of $45,000 and a voluntary surrender of his food handler's license, which was the culinary equivalent of being disbarred. I did not come out of this unscathed. I was fired, of course, Kale. But let me tell you about the aftermath in more detail, because the aftermath is where the real story lives. The article made me famous, or infamous, depending on who you asked, in the restaurant industry. I became known as the whistleblower cook, which was not a title I had sought, but one that I could not escape. For months, every interview I went on, every networking event I attended, every industry function I showed up to, someone wanted to talk about Richard Fontaine and L'Etoile. They wanted inside details. They wanted to know what Richard was really like. They wanted to know if the rumors about the expired food were true, as though the article's exhaustive documentation of those rumors was not sufficient evidence. Some people in the industry saw me as a hero. They told me I had done what everyone wanted to do, but no one had the courage to do. They told me that Richard was not the only chef operating this way, that the industry was full of Richard Fontaines, and that my article had started a conversation that was long overdue. A prominent food writer even published an essay arguing that the culture of abuse in professional kitchens was a systemic problem that required systemic solutions, and she cited my story as the catalyst for the conversation. Others saw me as a traitor. They said I should have handled it internally. They said I had violated the sacred code of the kitchen, which was that what happened in the kitchen stayed in the kitchen. They said I had made it harder for other chefs to trust their staffs, and that no cook who had been at a restaurant for 2 years had the right to tear the whole thing down. A well-known chef, someone with multiple Michelin stars, posted on social media that anonymous whistleblowing was the tool of cowards, and that if you have a problem with your chef, you look them in the eye and quit like a professional. He did not address the food safety violations. He did not address the stolen recipes. He focused on the anonymity, because that was the easiest part to criticize. And criticizing the easy part is what people do when they do not want to confront the hard part. I learned a lot about human nature during those months. I learned that people will defend abusers if the abuser is talented enough or famous enough or powerful enough. I learned that the victims of abuse are often scrutinized more harshly than the abusers themselves. I learned that the word loyalty is frequently used as a weapon by people who have never been loyal to anyone. And I learned that the truth, once released into the world, takes on a life of its own, and you cannot control it, and you should not try, because the truth belongs to everyone, not just to the person who carried it, although fired is not quite the right word. The owner's lawyer called me and said that my employment was being terminated immediately and that the company reserved all rights to pursue legal action against me for the recordings. They never did pursue it, because their own lawyers knew that my recordings were legal and that any lawsuit would only generate more bad publicity. But the threat hung in the air for months, and there were times when I lay awake at night wondering if I had destroyed my own career along with Richard's. I had not. Within a month of the article's publication, I had received job offers from 6 restaurants in 3 cities. The offers were not from places like L'Etoile. They were from smaller, humbler kitchens run by chefs who cared more about food than about fame, and who understood that a kitchen is a team, not a dictatorship. I accepted a position as sous chef at a farm-to-table restaurant. The restaurant was called Table and Soil, and it was run by Diana Park, no relation to Sandra, a Korean-American chef who had spent a decade working in kitchens in New York and San Francisco before deciding that what she really wanted was a small restaurant in a small city where she could cook the food she wanted to cook without the pressure of Michelin stars and James Beard nominations, and the relentless machinery of culinary ambition. Diana's food was simple and honest, and deeply rooted in the seasons and the soil of the region. She sourced almost everything from local farms, including one that was run by her parents, who had emigrated from South Korea in the 1980s and had started growing Asian vegetables because they could not find the ingredients they missed from home. Working for Diana was like stepping out of a war zone and into a garden. She praised freely and specifically. She said things like, "Marcus, the acid balance on this vinaigrette is exactly right. And I love what you did with the turnips. The roasting time is perfect." She asked for my input on menu development and listened when I gave it. She gave me credit on the menu for dishes I created, without my having to ask, without my having to fight, without my having to install hidden cameras and build a legal case. She just did it, because that is what decent people do. The contrast was so stark that for the first few weeks I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop. I kept waiting for Diana to reveal some hidden cruelty, some narcissistic streak, some capacity for betrayal that would prove that Richard was not an anomaly but the rule. It never happened. Diana was simply a good person who happened to be a great chef, and working for her taught me more about leadership in 6 months than Richard had taught me about cooking in 2 years. She showed me that a kitchen can be both excellent and kind, that discipline and decency are not mutually exclusive, and that the best food comes not from fear but from love. In a city 3 hours from where I had been living, and on my first day, the head chef, a woman named Diana, who had read Sandra's article and recognized my recipe notebook in the accompanying photographs, shook my hand and said, "I am so glad you are here. I have been wanting to try that celery root dish." I made it for her that night, with the hazelnut oil. She closed her eyes and made a small sound of pleasure, and she said, "This is yours, all yours." And for the first time in 2 years, standing in a kitchen that smelled like rosemary and bread and possibility, I felt like I could breathe again. Richard Fontaine, as far as I know, is living in a suburb of the city where L'Etoile used to be, working in restaurant consulting, which is what chefs do when they can no longer cook. I have heard, through the grapevine that connects every kitchen in the industry like an invisible nervous system, that he tells people he left L'Etoile on his own terms, and that the article was exaggerated, and that he was the real victim in the whole situation. I have also heard that no one believes him, and that every restaurant he approaches for work does a background check and finds the article and decides to pass. I do not hate Richard. I spent a long time hating him. There were people who told me I should have gone to the owner sooner, that I should have reported the food safety violations immediately rather than waiting months to build a case. They are not wrong. If someone had gotten sick from the expired food or the improper storage temperatures, I would have carried that guilt for the rest of my life. I thought about that every single day during the months I was gathering evidence. I wrestled with it. I lost sleep over it. In the end, I justified the delay by telling myself that a rushed report with incomplete evidence would be dismissed, that Richard would destroy the evidence and retaliate against me, and that the only way to create lasting change was to build an airtight case that could not be denied or explained away. I still do not know if that justification was sufficient. I know that no one got sick. I know that the health department's investigation confirmed every single violation I had documented, and I know that L'Etoile is closed and Richard is out of the industry. But the question of whether I waited too long, whether I prioritized my revenge over public safety, is one that I will carry with me for a long time. I also want to talk about the other people in that kitchen, because they deserve to be more than footnotes in someone else's revenge story. There was Maria, the pastry chef, who had been at L'Etoile for 5 years and who made the most extraordinary bread I have ever tasted. Richard treated her with slightly less contempt than the rest of us, which was not kindness but strategy. Because Maria's bread was the one thing on the menu that Richard had not stolen. Because bread is a science more than an art, and Richard had no interest in science. Maria was the one who cried when she read Sandra's article, not because she was sad about what happened to Richard, but because she said, I knew all of it, and I did nothing, and that makes me complicit. She was not wrong. None of us were innocent. We all saw what Richard was doing, and we all chose silence, because silence was easier than confrontation, and because the restaurant industry does not reward whistleblowers, it destroys them. There was also David, the sous chef, who had been Richard's second in command for 3 years and who had his own complicated relationship with the credit theft. David had created several dishes that ended up on the menu under Richard's name, just as I had, but David had made a different choice than I did. He had accepted it. He had convinced himself that it was just how the industry worked, that the head chef always got credit for the team's work, that this was the natural order of things. When my article came out, David was the first person Richard called. Richard screamed at him for 45 minutes. David listened. Then David hung up, packed his knives, and never went back to L'Etoile. He sent me a text message that said, "You did what I couldn't. Thank you." I did not respond because I did not know what to say. Thank you felt insufficient. I'm sorry felt presumptuous. So I said nothing, and I have always regretted that, because David deserved better from me, just as I deserved better from Richard. And it ate me up the way his stolen credit ate at my sense of self-worth. And one day, I realized that hating him was giving him power over me that he no longer deserved. He was a small man in a big hat, a mediocre talent, who survived by consuming the creativity of others. And now the hat is gone and the talent was never really there, and all that is left is a small man in a suburb telling stories that no one believes. I still cook. I cook every day, and I create new dishes. I have my own restaurant now. It is small, 28 seats. The kitchen is barely big enough for 4 people, and on busy nights we are pressed shoulder to shoulder, and the heat is every bit as intense as it was at L'Etoile. But it is a different kind of heat. It is the heat of people who love what they are doing and respect the people they are doing it with. I do not scream. I do not throw things. I say please and thank you, and when someone creates a dish that is beautiful, I say their name when I put it on the menu, because the name matters. The name is the truth. The name is the thing that Richard tried to erase and that I have sworn, on every menu I ever write, to preserve. My celery root puree is still on the menu. It is still the best thing I have ever created. Sometimes, on a quiet night after service, I make a plate for myself and I sit in the empty dining room and I eat it slowly, tasting every note. And I think about the version of myself who stood in Richard's kitchen and created that dish for the first time, and I feel a tenderness toward that person that I cannot quite articulate. They were brave in a way they did not know they were being. They were creating beauty in a place that was designed to crush beauty, and they kept creating, even when every signal told them to stop. And I put them on plates, and people eat them and enjoy them, and some of them even close their eyes and make small sounds of pleasure. The difference is that now, when a dish is mine, everyone knows it. I think about Richard less and less as time goes on, which I suppose is the natural progression of healing. But there are moments when something triggers the memory, and I am back in that kitchen, feeling the heat and the pressure and the weight of his expectations, which were always heavier than they needed to be, because they were built on a foundation of theft and deceit rather than genuine skill. I think about the celery root dish the most, not the version that appeared on L'Etoile's menu under Richard's name, but the version I made that first night, when I was just trying to solve a problem with what I had available. That version was imperfect. The puree was slightly too thick because I was rushing. The scallops were a touch over-seared because I was nervous about plating something Richard had not approved. But it was honest. It was mine. It was the purest expression of my cooking that I had ever produced. And it emerged not from careful planning, but from necessity and instinct and the simple desire to put something beautiful on a plate. That is what cooking is supposed to be. That is what it was, before Richard made it about power and credit and ego. And that is what it is again, now, in my own small kitchen, with my own small team, and my own name on the menu, written in my own hand, where it always should have been. The menu says Marcus's celery root puree, and Marcus's duck with cherry gastrique. And that is not ego. That is truth. That is the thing that Richard Fontaine stole from me, and the thing I took back, one plate at a time. Story 1. I dismantled the most corrupt HOA president in suburbia. Chapter 1. The Magnolia has blight. I have lived in Magnolia Springs Estates for 19 years. 19 years of carefully manicured lawns, of Sunday morning porch coffee, of waves to neighbors I have known longer than some of my own kin. I moved here after Doris passed, needed the quiet, needed the magnolias. I am Gerald Blevins, retired CPA, age 67, and I have balanced more books than most people have read. 32 years at Harrington, Crew & Associates in downtown Birmingham. I know what a clean ledger looks like. I know what a dirty one looks like, too. I have testified in 17 fraud cases, federal court, state court, once in front of a grand jury so stiff and formal I thought I was at a funeral. But I never thought I would use those skills on my own homeowners association. Magnolia Springs Estates sits on what used to be the Waverly Plantation, 300 acres carved into quarter-lot parcels back in 2003. Each lot is between 1 and 2 acres. The houses are what the real estate listings call Southern Estate style, which means white columns, wraparound porches, and roof lines that try very hard to look like they were built before the Civil War, even though the drywall was still drying when Bush was president. There are 87 homes in the development. The HOA fees are $425 per month, which is on the steep side for this part of Jefferson County. But we have amenities: a clubhouse with a pool, tennis courts that nobody uses, a fishing pond stocked with bass every spring, and 13 acres of what the developer called common green space, but what everybody just calls the back meadow. The HOA board has 5 members. 4 are fine people who volunteer their time and mean well. The 5th is Dale Pickford. Dale moved into Magnolia Springs in 2014, into the big house on Crestridge Court, with the circular driveway and the fountain that he never turns on anymore. He is 54 years old, broad-shouldered, with a jaw like a cinder block and a smile that never quite reaches his eyes. He wears polo shirts in colors that do not exist in nature. His wife, Candace, teaches Sunday school at First Baptist, and has the kind of voice that makes you feel like you have already disappointed her. Dale told everyone he was in property management. That was technically true. What he did not say was that his property management company, Pinnacle Holdings LLC, had exactly one client, himself. And what he really did was buy distressed commercial properties, flip them with the minimum legally required renovations, and sell them to people who did not know better. I knew this because I looked it up. I look everything up. It is a sickness, probably. Dale volunteered for the HOA board the same year he moved in. He brought cookies to the first meeting. Homemade, or at least homemade looking. Chocolate chip with sea salt. They were very good. I had 3. Within 6 months, he was president. The previous president, Herb Kowalski, a retired postal worker with a bad hip and a worse temper, stepped down citing personal reasons. I ran into Herb at the Piggly Wiggly a few weeks later, and he told me, in a voice low enough that the cashier could not hear, that Dale had made his life a living Gehenna, and that he was not going to fight a man who smiles like that. I did not think much of it at the time. People complain about HOAs the way they complain about the weather. It is background noise, the hum of suburban dissatisfaction. But I noticed things. I always notice things. Chapter 2. The Selective Application of Justice. The first thing I noticed was the fence. Ronnie and Delia Ashworth live on Loblolly Lane, 3 houses down from me. Ronnie is a foreman at the Caterpillar plant in Jasper. Delia homeschools their 4 children and sells handmade soap at the farmer's market in Hoover. They are good people, quiet, church-going. Their lawn is immaculate, which in Magnolia Springs is not a compliment so much as a survival requirement. In March of 2021, Ronnie built a fence. A white picket fence, pressure-treated pine, 4 feet tall, running along the back of his property where it abuts the back meadow. A charming fence, the kind of fence that makes you think of fireflies and lemonade. 3 days after Ronnie finished, he received a certified letter from the HOA. The fence was 2 inches too tall. The approved height for perimeter fencing in Magnolia Springs was 48 inches, and Ronnie's fence, according to the letter, measured 50 inches at its highest point due to an uneven grade. Ronnie was given 14 days to correct the violation or face a fine of $50 per day. Now, I want you to understand something about Ronnie Ashworth. He is not a wealthy man, not by Magnolia Springs standards. His house is one of the smaller models, still valued at around $420,000, but that is entry-level for our neighborhood. He saved for 2 years to build that fence. He did the work himself, on weekends, with a borrowed post-hole digger and a level that he had to tape back together after his youngest son used it as a sword. He was devastated. Delia told my wife. Well, she told me, since I do not have a wife anymore. But she told me the way you tell a neighbor, standing at the mailbox, that Ronnie had sat in his truck in the driveway for 45 minutes after reading that letter. Just sat there. I measured Ronnie's fence myself the next morning, with a tape measure and a spirit level, the way a proper surveyor would do it if a proper surveyor were willing to drive 30 miles to measure a 4-foot picket fence. The fence was 48 inches. Exactly. On the high side, the low side, the middle, 48 inches. I mentioned this to Dale at the next board meeting, which was held in the clubhouse on a Tuesday evening. The room smelled like industrial carpet cleaner and the lavender air freshener that somebody, I suspected Candace, had plugged into every outlet. "It's about the grading, Gerald," Dale said, leaning back in his chair with the easy confidence of a man who has never been wrong about anything. "The ordinance specifies the height must be measured from the highest natural grade point adjacent to the structure. There is no such specification in the CC&Rs, I said. I have read them. Twice. The CC&Rs are the covenants, conditions, and restrictions. The founding document of any HOA. The Magnolia Springs CC&Rs run to 46 pages, and I have read every single one, including the amendments, because I am the kind of person who reads the terms and conditions." Dale smiled at me the way a patient teacher smiles at a slow child. "We issued an interpretation memo last year. Board vote, 4-1. I don't recall seeing that memo. It was emailed to all residents. I checked when I got home." Dale had sent the email at 11:47 p.m. on a Friday night in November. The interpretation memo was attached as a PDF. The body of the email was 3 words, "For your records." Ronnie Ashworth paid a contractor $300 to shave 2 inches off his fence posts. I saw him out there on a Saturday, doing the work himself while the contractor supervised. It rained that afternoon. He kept going. The second thing I noticed was about the paint. Magnolia Springs has a palette, an approved palette. 15 exterior colors, each with a poetic name dreamed up by the developer's marketing team: Magnolia White, Live Oak Gray, Confederate Jasmine Cream, Spanish Moss Sage. You get the idea. In April of 2021, Connie Marsh, a widow who has lived on Dogwood Circle since the development opened, painted her front door. She chose a color called Nantucket Red, which was not on the approved palette. It was close to Bridal Wreath Blush, but it was not Bridal Wreath Blush. Connie was given 30 days to repaint or face fines totaling, eventually, $5,000. Connie was 73 years old. She had chosen the paint color because it matched the azaleas her late husband Frank had planted the year before he died of pancreatic cancer. She told me this at the mailbox, the same place Delia Ashworth had told me about Ronnie. I do not know what it is about mailboxes in this neighborhood, but they are where the truth gets told. Now, at the same time, Connie was being threatened with $5,000 in fines for a door that was the wrong shade of pink. Dale Pickford was building a shed. Not just any shed, a structure. In his backyard. Behind his pool. It was, by any reasonable definition, an accessory dwelling unit. It had electricity, it had a window unit air conditioner, it had a door with a deadbolt. The CC&Rs are very clear about accessory structures. They must be approved by the Architectural Review Committee, which at that point had not met in 11 months because Dale kept canceling the meetings. They must not exceed 200 square feet. They must match the exterior finish of the primary residence. Dale's shed was approximately 400 square feet. It was clad in corrugated metal. It looked like a shipping container that had been taught to sit up and beg. Nobody sent Dale a certified letter. Nobody measured his building. Nobody cited the CC&Rs or the interpretation memo or the approved palette. I brought this up at the next board meeting. Gerald, that structure is temporary, Dale said. It has a concrete slab foundation, I said. I am not a structural engineer, but I have been around concrete long enough to know that temporary is not a word that applies to it. It's for storage, pool equipment. Pool equipment does not require air conditioning. Dale looked at me for a long moment. The other board members, Susan Yang, a pediatrician, Marcus Williams, a software engineer, and Peggy Nolan, a retired school principal, looked at their papers, or at the ceiling, or at the interesting pattern the overhead fluorescent lights made on the table. We'll look into it, Dale said. They did not look into it. Chapter 3. The ledger begins to speak. I am going to tell you something about myself that may surprise you, given that I am telling you this entire story. I am not a confrontational person. I do not enjoy conflict. I spent 32 years in a profession where conflict meant someone was probably going to prison, and I found that aspect of the work deeply unpleasant. What I enjoy is order. I enjoy a clean ledger. I enjoy the satisfaction of a reconciliation that balances to the penny. I enjoy the way a well-kept set of financial records tells a story that is true, whether the people who created those records want it to be true or not. So when I began to look into the HOA's finances, I did not do it because I was on a crusade. I did it because the numbers did not make sense, and numbers that do not make sense keep me up at night. Here is what I knew. Our HOA has 87 homes. At $425 per month, the annual assessment revenue is approximately $443,000. Add in the reserve fund contributions, the late fees, the special assessments that Dale had pushed through in 2019 and 2020, and the total annual budget was right around $610,000. $610,000 is a significant amount of money. It pays for the pool maintenance, the landscaping of the common areas, the insurance, the property management fee, the legal retainer, and the contributions to the reserve fund for future capital improvements. I requested the financial records. This is my right as a homeowner. Alabama law is quite clear on this point. Section 35-8A 407 of the Alabama Uniform Condominium Act and the broader Homeowners Association statutes grant any member the right to inspect and copy the association's financial records upon written request. I submitted my request in writing. Certified mail, return receipt requested. Dale called me 2 days later. Gerald, I appreciate your interest in the association's finances, but I want to make sure you understand that these records are complex, and we wouldn't want you to misinterpret anything. I am a retired CPA, Dale. I have a master's degree in accounting. I think I can manage. I just don't want you wasting your time. I assure you, Dale, my time is my own to waste. He sent the records. A thumb drive, in a padded envelope, delivered to my mailbox. I plugged it into my laptop on a Wednesday afternoon in June, expecting to spend a pleasant evening reconciling bank statements and confirming that everything was in order. I did not sleep that night. The records were a mess, not the kind of mess that comes from incompetence, though there was plenty of that, the kind of mess that comes from concealment. The bank statements did not match the general ledger. The general ledger did not match the budget reports that had been distributed to homeowners. The budget reports did not match the tax filings. It was as if 3 different people had kept 3 different sets of books, and none of them had ever spoken to each other. But I am a patient man. I have reconciled accounts for companies with 73 subsidiaries across 14 countries. I once spent 3 weeks in a windowless room in Atlanta, untangling a Ponzi scheme that had ensnared 400 retirees. I know how to follow the money. I started with the basics. The HOA's operating account at Regions Bank. I obtained the statements going back 5 years. Dale had only sent me 2 years, but I had requested 5, and after a follow-up letter citing the applicable statute, he had complied. The first thing I noticed was the landscaping contract. Magnolia Springs had been using the same landscaping company since the development was built. Southern Green Landscaping, owned by a man named Tommy Bledsoe. Tommy was reliable. His crews showed up every Tuesday. The common areas looked like golf courses. He charged $4,000 per month, which was reasonable for 13 acres of maintained green space, plus the clubhouse grounds and the entrance medians. In January of 2020, the landscaping contract was transferred to a company called Greenscape Professional Services LLC. The monthly fee increased to $7,200. I looked up Greenscape Professional Services LLC on the Alabama Secretary of State website. It had been registered in November of 2019. The registered agent was Candace Pickford. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after I found that. Candace Pickford, Sunday school teacher, voice of gentle disappointment, was the registered agent for the company that had received a $3,200 per month increase in the HOA landscaping contract. That was $38,400 per year. Over the course of the contract, which ran through December of 2023, the total increase would be $153,600. I made a pot of coffee. I poured myself a cup. I sat back down at the table. I kept reading. The pool maintenance contract told a similar story. The original company, AquaClear Pools, had been replaced by Crystal Clear Aquatics LLC in June of 2020. The monthly fee had increased from $1,800 to $3,200. The registered agent for Crystal Clear Aquatics LLC was, again, Candace Pickford. The Security Patrol contract, replaced in August of 2020. New company, Magnolia Security Solutions LLC. Old fee, $2,200 per month for weekend patrols. New fee, $4,500 per month for weekend patrols. Registered agent, you can probably guess. I counted 4 such contracts: landscaping, pool maintenance, security, holiday decoration installation and removal, a service that had not existed before Dale took over, but was now apparently essential at a cost of $15,000 per year, payable to Festive Touches LLC. Registered agent, Candace Pickford. The total additional cost of these inflated contracts, compared to the previous providers or to no provider at all in the case of the decorations, was approximately $212,000 per year. Over 3 years, that was $636,000. $636,000 that had flowed from the HOA's operating account into companies controlled by the HOA president's wife. But that was not the worst of it. Chapter 4: The Reserve Fund and the Hole It Left. The reserve fund is the savings account of a homeowners association. It is meant to pay for major repairs and capital improvements, roof replacements, road resurfacing, pool resurfacing, that sort of thing. In Magnolia Springs, the reserve fund had been built up over 15 years to a balance of approximately $320,000. When I reviewed the reserve fund statements, I found that the balance had declined from $318,000 in January of 2020 to approximately $41,000 in May of 2022. That is a reduction of $277,000 in 28 months. The Reserve Fund study, which had been commissioned in 2019 and updated annually, recommended a balance of no less than $250,000 to cover anticipated capital expenditures over the following 5 years. Those expenditures included the resurfacing of the pool, which was estimated at $85,000 and was already 2 years overdue, and the repair of the clubhouse roof, which had been leaking since Hurricane Zeta and was estimated at $62,000. Where did the money go? I traced every disbursement from the reserve fund. This took me 4 days. 4 days of cross-referencing check images with board minutes, with contract documents, with invoices. What I found was this. In March of 2020, the board approved a comprehensive drainage improvement project for the back meadow at a cost of $120,000. The contractor was Pickford Property Group LLC. I will let you guess the registered agent. The drainage project, according to the board minutes, was urgently needed to address persistent flooding and erosion issues in the common area. The minutes quoted a report from Southeastern Environmental Consultants, which had apparently conducted a site assessment and recommended the work. I looked up Southeastern Environmental Consultants. The company existed, technically. It had a website, a single page, really, with a stock photo of a man in a hard hat looking thoughtfully at a patch of dirt. The phone number went to a Google Voice account. The listed address was a virtual office suite in Hoover. The site assessment report was 3 pages long. It contained no data, no measurements, no soil analysis, no hydrological modeling. It read like a college freshman's book report on a subject he had not studied. It concluded that immediate remediation is recommended to prevent further degradation of the common area and potential liability to the association. $120,000 based on a 3-page report from a company that appeared to exist only on paper. I walked out to the back meadow one morning with my boots on. I am not an engineer, but I have eyes. The drainage in the meadow was fine. It was a meadow. It is supposed to collect water. That is what meadows do. The erosion that the report described was a gully about 6 inches deep near the northeast corner where rainwater naturally funneled toward the storm drain that the original developer had installed. I took photographs. I took measurements. I made notes. There was no evidence that any drainage work had been performed. None. No new pipes, no grading, no culverts, no French drains, no nothing. $120,000. Gone. A second reserve fund disbursement caught my attention. In October of 2020, the board approved emergency tree removal and hazard mitigation in the common areas at a cost of $67,000. The contractor was, of course, Pickford Property Group LLC. I walk the common areas every morning. Doris and I used to walk together, and after she passed, I kept the routine because stopping would have meant admitting that she was really gone, and I was not ready for that. Not then. Maybe not ever. I knew every tree in those 13 acres, the ancient water oak by the pond with the split trunk that looked like a pair of dancing legs, the cluster of pecan trees near the north entrance that dropped nuts on the road every October like little green grenades, the magnolia, the real magnolia, the one the development was named for, standing at the center of the meadow like a sentinel, its roots deep in the red clay. None of them had been removed. Not one. $67,000. Gone. A third disbursement. In February of 2021, the board approved clubhouse renovation and ADA compliance upgrades at a cost of $90,000. The contractor was, you are going to love this, not one of the Pickford companies. It was a legitimate company, Birmingham Commercial Renovations, a firm with a real office and real employees and a real reputation. I called them. I identified myself as a representative of the HOA board and asked for a summary of the work performed. The very nice woman on the other end of the phone looked up the project and told me that the total contract value had been $34,000, not $90,000. The work had been completed on schedule and to specification. They had been paid in full, $34,000. So, the board minutes said $90,000. The actual cost was $34,000. The difference was $56,000. I checked the check images. The check to Birmingham Commercial Renovations was for $34,000, as the woman had said. But there was a second check, drawn on the same date, from the reserve fund, payable to Pickford Property Group LLC, for $56,000, with the memo line reading, Clubhouse Renovation, Project Management and Oversight. Project Management and Oversight. $56,000. I leaned back in my chair, and I stared at the ceiling, and I thought about Ronnie Ashworth's fence, and Connie Marsh's front door, and the corrugated metal shed behind Dale Pickford's pool that was definitely not storing pool equipment. I had been a CPA for 32 years. I had seen embezzlement, fraud, misappropriation, and plain old-fashioned theft in every configuration the human mind could devise. But there was something about this one. Something about the smallness of it, the pettiness, the way it had been inflicted on neighbors who trusted each other, that made my hands shake. I was angry, and I am not a man who gets angry easily. Chapter 5. The Personal Use. I want to tell you about the clubhouse. The Magnolia Springs Estates Clubhouse is a nice building, 6,000 square feet, a great room with a vaulted ceiling and a stone fireplace. A commercial kitchen that has never been used for anything more ambitious than a crock pot of meatballs. A fitness room with 3 treadmills, one of which has been broken since 2018. A conference room, 2 bathrooms, a covered porch overlooking the pool. It is available for residents to rent for private events, birthday parties, anniversary dinners, book club meetings. The rental fee is $200, which includes a $200 security deposit that is refunded if the space is left clean. Between January of 2020 and May of 2022, the clubhouse was rented by Dale Pickford for private events on 23 occasions. The events were listed in the rental log as board meeting, community event, HOA function, or, on one memorable occasion, seasonal celebration. I obtained the security camera footage from the clubhouse. This required a bit of doing. The cameras are managed by Magnolia Security Solutions LLC, Candace's company, you will recall. Dale initially told me the footage was only retained for 30 days. I pointed out that the security contract specified 90-day retention. He said the hard drive had failed. I asked to see the maintenance records for the hard drive. He said he would get back to me. He did not get back to me. But the clubhouse manager, a part-time employee named Wanda Fry, remembered me from the time I had helped her figure out the QuickBooks setup, and she told me, very quietly, that there was a backup system that Dale did not know about because the installer had set it up as a favor to the previous board president, Herb Kowalski. Herb, God bless Herb Kowalski. Wanda gave me access to the backup system. I reviewed the footage for all 23 dates. None of the events were board meetings. None were community events. Several appeared to be private parties. Dale's daughter's engagement party in April of 2021 was particularly well attended, with catering that looked like it cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. The seasonal celebration in December of 2020 was a Christmas party with what appeared to be a live band. Dale had not paid a single rental fee. Not once. Not $200, not the security deposit, nothing. The HOA had, however, paid for the catering through an invoice submitted by Festive Touches LLC, Candace's company again, for community holiday event catering. The amount was $4,700. The total value of Dale's unauthorized use of the clubhouse, including rental fees, cleaning fees, and catering costs charged to the HOA, but consumed privately, was approximately $26,000 over 2 years. It was not the biggest number on my growing list, but it was the one that made me the maddest, because it was not just theft, it was theater. It was Dale Pickford standing in front of 86 families and pretending to be their neighbor while he picked their pockets and ate their food and drank their wine and laughed at their jokes. Chapter 6. Building the Case. I spent the month of June compiling my findings. I created spreadsheets. I created timelines. I created charts that mapped the flow of money from the HOA's accounts to the Pickford-controlled companies. I took photographs. I gathered documents. I organized everything into a binder, a real, physical, 3-ring binder with tabs and section dividers, because I am old enough to believe that important things belong on paper. The total amount I could document was approximately $843,000 over 2.5 years. This included the inflated contracts, the fraudulent reserve fund disbursements, the personal use of HOA facilities, and a handful of smaller items. An HOA-purchased riding lawnmower that Dale kept at his house, a community emergency generator that was installed at the Pickford residence, printing costs for what appeared to be marketing materials for Pinnacle Holdings that were billed to the HOA's office supply account. $843,000 from 86 families, from people like Ronnie Ashworth, who could not afford to lose 2 inches of his fence, from Connie Marsh, who was threatened with fines for a door that honored her dead husband. I needed to be careful. I knew that. Dale was not a stupid man. He was a corrupt man, but he was not stupid. He had covered his tracks reasonably well. The shell companies, the interpretation memos sent at midnight, the delayed response to records requests. He understood, at least intuitively, the mechanics of concealment. But he had made mistakes. The kind of mistakes that a smart man makes when he becomes arrogant. When he begins to believe that the people around him are too complacent, or too frightened, or too busy to look closely. His biggest mistake was me. I am not a busy man. I am a retired accountant with a walking habit, and an internet connection, and a moral compass that Doris spent 39 years calibrating to point due north. I have time. I have patience. I have the skills to follow a dollar bill through a maze of shell companies and bank accounts and fabricated invoices until I find where it went and who took it. By the end of June, I had a binder that was 2 inches thick and a stomach that felt like I had swallowed a cinder block. I knew what I had to do, but I also knew that I could not do it alone. One man with a binder is a crank. A group of homeowners with a shared grievance is a movement. I needed allies. Chapter 7: The Unlikely Coalition. My first recruit was Ronnie Ashworth. I invited him over for coffee on a Saturday morning, not at the mailbox, at my kitchen table, with the good mugs and the sugar bowl that Doris had painted with little blue flowers. Ronnie was suspicious, not of me, but of the conversation. When a neighbor you do not know well invites you for coffee in this part of the world, it usually means they want to borrow something or sell you insurance. I poured him a cup. I sat down. I said, "Ronnie, I am going to tell you something, and I need you to not react until I am finished." Ronnie looked at me. He has those steady blue eyes that tell you he has spent a lifetime operating heavy machinery and knows the value of patience. I told him everything. The shell companies, the inflated contracts, the reserve fund, the clubhouse, the fence. When I finished, Ronnie did not say anything for a long time. He looked at his coffee. He looked at the sugar bowl with the blue flowers. He looked at me. "That son of a bitch," he said, very quietly. "Yes," I said. "How much?" $843,000, that I can document. Probably more that I can't. Ronnie picked up his coffee mug. He held it with both hands. His knuckles were white. "That's about $9,800 per household," I said. "Over 2.5 years. More, actually, if you only count the years you've been here." Ronnie set the mug down. "What do we do?" "I need you to talk to people. Quietly. Not everyone. Just the ones you trust. The ones who have been here a while. The ones who have noticed things." "Like who?" "Like Herb Kowalski." Ronnie almost smiled. "Herb hates Dale." "Yes. That is why I want you to start with Herb." Susan was already on the board, which made her a delicate case. She was a careful, thoughtful person who had voted with Dale on most of the contract approvals, not because she was complicit, but because she had not examined the contracts closely and had trusted the president's recommendations. This is, I should note, how most board members operate in most HOAs. They rely on the president and the property manager to bring them reasonable proposals, and they approve them in good faith. Susan's husband, David, was an attorney. Corporate litigation, specifically. This was useful to me not because I needed legal advice, though I would not turn it down, but because Susan understood, at a professional level, the concept of fiduciary duty. I met Susan for lunch at a place called Nabil's Cafe in Homewood. Good Mediterranean food. We sat outside because it was July, and the inside of the restaurant felt like a sauna wrapped in a damp towel. "Susan, I need to show you something." I placed a summary printout on the table between our plates of hummus and falafel, 1 page, a table, company names, contract values, registered agents, and the total. She read it again, she set it down, she picked up her fork, she put it down, she looked at me. "Gerald, if this is accurate." "It is accurate. I have the documentation, bank statements, Secretary of State filings, check images, invoices, everything." "This is criminal." "Yes, it is. But I voted for these contracts. I approved." "You approved based on false information provided to you by the president. That is not complicity. That is victimhood." Susan was quiet for a moment. A bird landed on the railing next to our table, looked at us with the vacant judgment that only birds can achieve, and flew away. "What do you need from me?" she asked. "Access. I need access to the board's records that are not in the financial package. Emails, correspondence, the original bids for the contracts, if they exist, and I need you to call a special meeting." "What kind of special meeting?" "A meeting to discuss a recall." Chapter 8: The Town Hall. We held the meeting on a Thursday evening in August. Not at the clubhouse. Dale would have known about it, and he would have found a way to disrupt it. We held it at the community center in Hoover, which Ronnie's sister-in-law booked for us under the pretense of a family reunion. 52 households were represented. That is 60% of the neighborhood. In HOA politics, that is a landslide. I stood at the front of the room. I had my binder. I had a projector that Marcus Williams, the software engineer on the board who had quietly joined our cause after I showed him the reserve fund numbers, had hooked up to a laptop. I am not a public speaker. I am an accountant. Accountants communicate through spreadsheets and carefully worded memos. The idea of standing in front of 52 couples and explaining that they had been robbed was viscerally uncomfortable. But Doris had been a school teacher for 35 years, and she used to tell me that the difference between a good teacher and a great teacher is the willingness to stand in front of a room full of people who would rather be anywhere else and make them care about something. I made them care. I started with the numbers, plain, unadorned, devastating numbers, the contracts, the shell companies, the registered agent. I showed them the Secretary of State printouts. I showed them the check images. I showed them the side-by-side comparison of the old landscaping contract and the new one, with the same scope of work at nearly double the price. I showed them the reserve fund balance over time, a chart that looked like a ski slope, 318,000 down to 41,000. I showed them where the money went. The drainage project that never happened. The tree removal that never happened. The clubhouse renovation that cost $90,000 when the actual work cost $34,000. I showed them the security camera footage from the clubhouse, Dale's daughter's engagement party, or the Christmas party with the live band, the board meetings that were clearly not board meetings. The room was very quiet. Then I told them about Ronnie's fence and Connie's door, and how the rules that Dale enforced with such enthusiasm against his neighbors were the same rules he ignored when they applied to himself. Connie Marsh was sitting in the third row. She had her hands folded in her lap. She was wearing the Nantucket red door color as a cardigan, and I thought that was the bravest thing I had ever seen. When I finished, there was a silence that lasted maybe 10 seconds. In a room full of Southerners, 10 seconds of silence is an eternity. We are a people who fill silence with blessings and complaints, and observations about the weather and the price of gasoline. 10 seconds of silence means something has happened that words have not caught up with yet. Herb Kowalski broke the silence. "What do we do?" Herb said. Herb, with his bad hip, and his righteous anger, and his use of the word Gehenna to describe his experience under Dale's presidency. Herb, who had been waiting 3 years for someone to ask that question. "We recall him," I said. "Alabama law allows for the recall of an HOA board member by a vote of the membership. We need a petition signed by owners representing at least 20% of the total voting interest. Then we need a special meeting with a quorum and a majority vote to remove." "How long?" someone asked from the back. 60 days, if we move quickly." "And if he fights it?" "He will fight it. He has already hired an attorney. Well, the HOA has hired an attorney, on Dale's recommendation, at a cost of $12,000 per year. That attorney's name is Wayne Farley, and his firm represents Pickford Property Group LLC in its commercial real estate transactions." I let that sink in. "So, the attorney we are paying to represent the HOA also represents Dale's private company?" Susan said from her seat in the front row. "Yes. That is a spectacular conflict of interest." "Yes, it is." The meeting lasted 2 more hours. People asked questions. People shared stories. People who had been afraid to speak individually found courage in the collective. It was like a support group for the victims of a very specific kind of suburban crime. Dale's daughter's engagement party was brought up 4 separate times by 4 separate people, each of whom had been at the party and had wondered, at the time, how Dale could afford such a nice event when, according to neighborhood gossip, his property management business was struggling. The generator, the community emergency generator that was installed at Dale's house, was a particular sore point for the residents of Crestridge Court, who had all lost power for 4 days during the February ice storm of 2021, while Dale's house blazed with light like a lighthouse. I collected 47 signatures that night. We needed 17. Chapter 9, The Counterattack. Dale found out about the meeting within 24 hours. I do not know who told him, and it does not matter. In a neighborhood of 87 homes, there are no secrets. There are only delays. He called me on a Friday afternoon. His voice was calm, friendly, even. The voice of a man who had been a Boy Scout, and believed in the motto. Gerald, I heard there was a gathering last night. I'm sorry I wasn't invited. It was not an HOA event, Dale. It was a private gathering. That's so? Because I've had several neighbors tell me that you made some pretty serious accusations about me, about my family. I presented documentation, Dale. Financial records, public filings. There is a difference between an accusation and a presentation of evidence. A pause. The kind of pause that a man makes when he is deciding whether to be charming or threatening and has not yet committed to either. Gerald, I want you to think very carefully about what you're doing. These kinds of allegations, if they're not true, and they're not, they can be defamatory, libelous. I have a family, a reputation. I've served this community. You have served yourself, Dale, to the tune of approximately $843,000. Another pause, longer this time. I'm going to have to talk to the association's attorney about this. Wayne Farley? The attorney who also represents Pickford Property Group? I am sure he will give you very objective advice. I hung up, my hands were shaking again. On Monday, certified letters began arriving at the homes of everyone who had attended the meeting. The letters were from Wayne Farley, on the letterhead of Farley and Associates, and they warned the recipients that defamatory statements have been made about a member of the HOA board, and that continued dissemination of false and damaging information may result in legal action, including, but not limited to, claims for libel, slander, and tortious interference with business relations. The letters were threatening. They were also, I suspected, empty. Defamation requires false statements made with actual malice, and everything I had presented was true and documented. But threats do not need to be legally viable to be effective. They just need to be scary. 3 people called me to say they wanted to remove their names from the recall petition. I told them I understood. I told them there was no shame in self-preservation. I told them that the petition was already well over the threshold, and their individual signatures were not critical to the outcome. Ronnie Ashworth, when I told him about the calls, said something I will remember for the rest of my life. Gerald, I spent 12 years operating equipment that could crush a pickup truck. I think I can handle a letter from a lawyer. Ronnie did not remove his name. Chapter 10. The Recall. The recall election was held on October 15, 2022, in the clubhouse. The irony of holding the meeting to remove Dale Pickford in the building he had been using for private parties at the HOA's expense was not lost on anyone. Dale hired a parliamentary procedure consultant. An actual consultant, a man from Montgomery named Gerald, not me, the other Gerald, who charged $400 an hour to sit next to Dale and whisper in his ear during the meeting. This was paid for, I later discovered, out of the HOA's legal budget. 63 households were represented at the meeting. Quorum was 44. We had quorum and then some. Dale opened the meeting. He was wearing a navy blue polo shirt and khakis. His jaw was set. Candace sat behind him in the second row, her hands clasped in her lap, her Sunday school face firmly in place. He read a prepared statement. It lasted 12 minutes. In it, he described the allegations as baseless, politically motivated, and an orchestrated campaign by a small group of disgruntled homeowners with personal axes to grind. He said the financial irregularities were accounting discrepancies that had been identified and addressed. He said the contracts with the companies managed by his wife were fully disclosed to the board and awarded through a competitive bidding process. None of this was true, but he said it with conviction, and conviction has a currency in this world that truth sometimes lacks. Then it was my turn. I had 5 minutes. The parliamentary consultant, the other Gerald, had ruled that each side would have 5 minutes to present their case before the vote. Dale had used his 12, but nobody challenged this because the other Gerald had a clipboard and a very authoritative manner. I did not use my 5 minutes for a speech. I used it for a single exhibit. I had obtained, through a public records request to the Alabama Secretary of State, the complete filing history for all 5 of the Pickford-controlled companies. I had also obtained the bid proposals, or, rather, the lack thereof. There were no bid proposals. There was no competitive bidding process. The contracts had been presented to the board as take-it-or-leave-it recommendations from the president. I had printed all of this on a single large poster board. Company names, filing dates, registered agents, contract values, a big red circle around Candace Pickford's name, which appeared as the registered agent on all 5 entities. I held it up. I said nothing. I let it speak for itself. 53 votes to remove. 10 votes to retain. Dale Pickford was no longer the president of the Magnolia Springs Estates Homeowners Association. He did not react well. He stood up, he knocked over his chair. He pointed at me and said, "You have no idea what you've done." Then he walked out, and Candace followed him, and the parliamentary consultant followed both of them, and the door closed behind them with a sound like a gunshot. The remaining board members, Susan, Marcus, and Peggy, voted unanimously to appoint Susan as interim president. Susan immediately voted to engage new legal counsel. She voted to commission an independent forensic audit of the association's finances, and she voted to refer the matter to the Jefferson County District Attorney's Office. All 3 motions passed. Chapter 11. The Investigation. The forensic audit was conducted by a firm called Whitfield & Associates, out of Mobile. They are the best in the state for this kind of work. They charge $300 an hour, and they are worth every penny. The audit took 3 months. During those 3 months, I was interviewed by 2 investigators from the district attorney's office. One was named Brenda Tate. She was a young woman, maybe 30, with sharp eyes and a notebook that she filled with the kind of rapid, precise handwriting that suggested she had been a diligent student. The other was a man named Frank D'Amico. He was older, tired, the kind of tired that comes from 25 years of seeing what people do to each other when they think nobody is watching. They came to my house on a Tuesday in November. I made coffee. We sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I had shown Ronnie Ashworth the shell company documents, the same table where I had built the case that brought down a corrupt HOA president. "Mr. Blevins," Brenda said, "can you walk us through how you first became aware of the discrepancies?" I walked them through everything, from Ronnie's fence, to the reserve fund, to the security camera footage. I showed them the binder. I showed them the spreadsheets. I showed them the poster board, which I had kept because I am a sentimental old man. Frank D'Amico looked at the poster board for a long time. Then he looked at me. "You're a CPA," he said. "Retired. You did all of this yourself?" "With some help from neighbors." Frank nodded. "Mr. Blevins, in 25 years, I have seen a lot of fraud. Corporate fraud, government fraud, nonprofit fraud. But there is something about HOA fraud that gets under my skin. Maybe because it's so small, so petty, so personal. These are people's homes, their neighborhoods, the place where they raise their kids and walk their dogs and sit on the porch at the end of a long day." He paused. "It's not just money, it's trust. And when you steal that, you steal something that doesn't show up on any ledger." I understood exactly what he meant. The investigation expanded. Whitfield & Associates found more than I had. They traced bank accounts. They found that the money flowing into the Pickford-controlled companies had been used, in part, to pay down the mortgage on a vacation property in Gulf Shores. They found that Pinnacle Holdings, Dale's property management company, had received referrals from the HOA's attorney, Wayne Farley, in exchange for what appeared to be a kickback arrangement. They found that the community emergency generator installed at Dale's house had been paid for with HOA funds, and was, in fact, a whole house standby generator that retailed for approximately $14,000, installed. They found that Dale had used the HOA's credit card, which was supposed to be reserved for emergency maintenance expenses, to purchase personal items at Best Buy, Home Depot, and a liquor store in Hoover, totaling approximately $8,000 over 2 years. The total, by the time Whitfield & Associates finished, was over $1.1 million. Chapter 12. The Charges. On February 8, 2023, a Jefferson County grand jury returned a 12-count indictment against Dale Pickford. The charges included theft of property in the first degree, fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty. Candace Pickford was indicted on 4 counts related to her role as the registered agent for the shell companies and her involvement in the preparation of false invoices. Wayne Farley, the attorney, was referred to the Alabama State Bar for investigation. Dale surrendered to the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office on February 10th. They booked him, processed him, and released him on bond. His mugshot appeared in the Birmingham News, and I am not going to pretend I did not cut it out and put it on my refrigerator, next to a magnet shaped like a magnolia blossom that Doris had bought at a craft fair in 2004. He looked terrible in the mugshot. Not physically, he is still a large man with a strong jaw, but spiritually, his eyes were the eyes of a man who had just realized that the world is bigger and more observant than he had accounted for. I would like to tell you that justice was swift and satisfying. I would like to tell you that Dale was convicted, sentenced to a lengthy prison term, and that the stolen money was recovered and returned to the homeowners. The truth is more complicated, as the truth usually is. The criminal case is still pending as I write this. Dale's attorney, a new attorney, not Wayne Farley, has filed a series of motions to delay the proceedings. Discovery has been contentious. The prosecution has produced over 15,000 documents. The defense has requested additional time to review them. Civil suits have been filed by the HOA and by individual homeowners. The HOA's suit seeks restitution of the misappropriated funds. The individual suits seek damages for breach of fiduciary duty and emotional distress. Ronnie Ashworth is a named plaintiff in one of them. So is Connie Marsh. Dale and Candace have put their house in Magnolia Springs on the market. The asking price is $795,000, which is ambitious, given that the corrugated metal shed is still visible from the street, and the whole house generator, which legally belongs to the HOA, is attached to their electrical panel. The house has not sold. Chapter 13. The Aftermath. Susan Yang is the president of the HOA now. She is doing an excellent job. The landscaping contract has been returned to Tommy Bledsoe and Southern Green Landscaping, who was happy to have the work back, and who, upon learning what had happened, reduced his monthly fee by $500 as a gesture of goodwill. The pool was resurfaced in April, using money recovered from a partial settlement with one of the vendors who had been complicit in the scheme. The clubhouse roof was repaired in May. The reserve fund is being rebuilt, with contributions that Susan has structured to bring the balance back to recommended levels within 4 years. Ronnie Ashworth built a new fence last summer. White picket, pressure-treated pine, 52 inches tall. He built it to the height he wanted, the height that looked right, the height that Frank Marsh would have approved of if Frank Marsh had still been alive, and if Frank Marsh had any say in the matter, which he did not, because the new board repealed Dale's interpretation memo on fence heights. Nobody has complained about Ronnie's fence. Connie Marsh repainted her front door. Nantucket red. It is still not on the approved palette. Susan Yang, in her first official act as president, added Nantucket red to the palette. She called it Frank's Red in the amendment. The amendment passed unanimously. Herb Kowalski came to the next board meeting as a guest speaker. He talked about the importance of transparency in HOA governance. He talked about the rights of homeowners. He talked about the difference between authority and accountability. Then he looked at the 5 board members, Susan, Marcus, Peggy, and the 2 new members who had been elected to fill the vacancies created by the recall, and he said, "You all have a responsibility that most people underestimate. You are managing a $500,000 enterprise that affects the daily lives of 86 families. Take it seriously. Be honest. And for God's sake, read the contracts before you sign them." The room laughed, but it was the kind of laugh that people make when they are agreeing with something that is not really funny. Chapter 14. What I learned. I have been asked, by several neighbors and by Brenda Tate from the district attorney's office, why I did it. Why I spent 6 months of my retirement conducting a forensic audit of my homeowners association. Why I put myself in the crosshairs of a man who, whatever his faults, had resources and lawyers and a willingness to use both. The answer is simple, and it is not simple at all. I did it because Doris would have wanted me to. Doris believed, with the unshakable conviction of a woman who spent 35 years teaching other people's children to read, that the world is made better by people who pay attention, who look closely, who do not accept what they are told just because the person telling them has a nice smile and a polo shirt in an unnatural shade of teal. She believed that competence is a moral obligation, that if you have a skill, you have a duty to use it, that looking the other way is not peace, it is complicity. I did it because I am an accountant, and the numbers were wrong, and wrong numbers make me crazy. I did it because Ronnie Ashworth sat in his truck for 45 minutes over a 2-inch discrepancy that did not even exist. I did it because Connie Marsh painted her front door the color of her dead husband's azaleas and was told it was wrong. I did it because Dale Pickford looked me in the eye and smiled and lied, and he did it in my neighborhood, to my neighbors, in the place where Doris and I raised our children and walked our dog and sat on our porch and watched the sun set over the magnolia trees. This is my neighborhood, these are my people, and nobody steals from my people while I am still breathing. Chapter 15. The Magnolia Still Stands. It is October now, almost a year since the recall election. The magnolia tree in the back meadow is dropping its leaves, which it does, with a kind of slow, deliberate grace that I have always found deeply moving. The leaves are large and leathery, and they turn from green to brown to the color of old leather, and they fall one by one, as if each one is taking its time, saying goodbye properly. I walk past the tree every morning. I have a path worn into the grass from 2 decades of footsteps. Doris and I used to walk this path together, and now I walk it alone, and the tree does not seem to mind the difference. The meadow is quiet. The drainage that Dale said needed $120,000 of repair is functioning exactly as it always has, which is to say, it collects water in the low spots and releases it slowly into the storm drain, the way a meadow is supposed to do. The pond is still there. The bass are still there. Tommy Bledsoe's crews still come every Tuesday, and the common areas still look like golf courses, and the entrance medians are still planted with seasonal flowers that make you feel like you are driving into a magazine spread. The clubhouse is rented most weekends now, by residents who pay the $200 fee and receive the $200 deposit back when they clean up. Wanda Fry still manages it, and she still calls me when she has a QuickBooks question, and I still help her because that is what neighbors do. The fence on Ronnie Ashworth's property is 52 inches tall, and it is beautiful. Delia planted climbing roses along it in the spring, and they bloomed all summer in a color that I can only describe as defiant. Connie Marsh's door is Nantucket Red, which is now officially called Frank's Red, and it is the most beautiful door in Magnolia Springs Estates. Dale Pickford's house is still for sale. The price has been reduced twice. The corrugated metal shed is still there. The generator, which the HOA has formally reclaimed through a legal process that Susan handled with her characteristic thoroughness, was removed in August by a crew from Generac, and the hole it left in the electrical panel was patched by an electrician named Phil, who charged a fair price and did not overbill. I sit on my porch in the evenings and I watch the sun set behind the magnolia tree in the meadow, and I think about the nature of small places. A neighborhood is a small place. 87 homes, a few hundred people, a handful of shared spaces. It is easy to think that nothing important happens in a small place, that the real drama, the real corruption, the real stories of good and evil happen somewhere else, in courtrooms and boardrooms and capitals, in the pages of newspapers and the feeds of social media. But Dale Pickford stole over $1 million from his neighbors in a small place. He used the rules of a small place, the CC&Rs, the Architectural Review Committee, the interpretation memos sent at midnight, as weapons against the people he was supposed to serve. He turned a small place into a small kingdom, and he taxed his subjects without their consent, and spent their money on his daughter's engagement party, and his wife's companies, and his corrugated metal shed. And it took a retired accountant with a 3-ring binder and a grudge to bring him down. If that is not a Southern Gothic story, I do not know what is. Epilogue, a letter I will never send. Dear Dale, I saw you at the Piggly Wiggly last week. You were in the produce section, squeezing avocados. You have lost weight. Your polo shirt was a normal color, blue, I think. You did not see me. Or if you did, you chose not to acknowledge it, which amounts to the same thing. I want you to know that I do not hate you. Hate is a waste of a good porch sunset, and I have too few of those left to spend them on you. But I want you to know that I understood what you were doing almost from the beginning. The fence, the door, the shed, the contracts. I saw it all, piece by piece, like a jigsaw puzzle assembling itself on my kitchen table. And I want you to know that the reason I did not stop you sooner is not because I was afraid of you. I was not afraid of you, Dale. I have testified in federal court. I have stared down men who stole the life savings of 400 retirees and lied about it while their victims sat in the gallery and wept. I did not stop you sooner because I wanted to make sure that when I did stop you, you would stay stopped. I wanted the case to be airtight. I wanted every number to balance. I wanted every document to be in order. I wanted the binder, that 2-inch, 3-ring, tabbed and divided binder, to be so thorough, so meticulous, so devastatingly complete, that no lawyer in the state of Alabama could find a crack in it. And it was. You are welcome to wonder, as you stand in the produce section squeezing avocados, how different your life would be if you had just been honest. If you had just managed the HOA the way it was supposed to be managed. If you had just been a neighbor. But you were not a neighbor, Dale. You were a thief in a polo shirt. And thieves in polo shirts are still thieves. Sincerely, Gerald Blevins, retired CPA, Magnolia Springs Estates. Resident since 2003. P.S. I still have your daughter's engagement party on the security footage. It was a lovely event. The band was excellent. You should have paid for it yourself.